viewers, my well-wishers, and my patrons. I am late tonight, but those who like to participate in my live streaming class are being advised to join because tonight's class is going to be a class on Shakespeare's Macbeth. Shakespeare's Macbeth, and I am going to discuss the role of the witches in Macbeth. The role of the witches in Macbeth. It's a very important question, it's a very pertinent question, and I think that Shakespeare was clever enough to utilize the presence of the witches in his play only to attract many people as the audience. The witches are in part corporal, in part supernatural, and in part the personified temptation of Macbeth himself. Again, I am repeating, in part corporal, in part supernatural, and in part personified temptation of Macbeth himself. Banquo and Macbeth, the two great generals, are returning from a great battle after having defeated the Norwegian troops. The Norwegian rebels, they were returning from the battle, and they both were the two great generals. And on their way home, they met three witches. And how was their appearance? You see that they have a peculiar appearance, horrid appearance. They have body, but they appear to be supernatural elements. They have been described like this. You see that the description given by Shakespeare is peculiar. Okay. For example, they looked like women. They looked like women, except that they had beards. They looked like women, but they had beards, and their withered skin, that is dried skin, and wild dresses made them look like unearthly creatures. Unearthly creatures. So I have already mentioned that they are in part corporal, they have physical appearance, but in part supernatural. That means they are unearthly creatures. And you see that Shakespeare has snatched the attention of the audience by a riddle. By a riddle that is very much confusing, but can draw the attention of the audience too much. For example, fair is foul and foul is fair. Here there is alliteration and there is onomatopoeia. Alliteration as well as onomatopoeia. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. Okay. The three witches symbolize also the personified temptation of Macbeth himself. Okay. The first witch addressed him as the Thane of Glamis, which actually I am telling you briefly the role of the witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth, because many have requested me to deliver a short lecture on the role of the witches in Shakespeare's tragedy Macbeth. Okay. So the first witch addressed Macbeth. Yes, sir. And you listen to this live streaming class and it may come to your benefit. You see that the first witch addressed him as the Thane of Glamis, which he actually was. So Macbeth was astonished to learn this from the witches, because it has evoked the curiosity of Macbeth. And the second witch addressed him as the Thane of Cawdor. So he was not the Thane of Cawdor at that time. At that time, when the witches met him in a filthy place, in a marshy land, actually Macbeth was not at that time the Thane of Cawdor. And the third witch addressed him as the King of Scotland. The King of Scotland was an absurd prediction from the witches, because at that time Duncan was at the throne. The old Duncan was at the throne, and it was quite impossible on the part of Macbeth to become the King of Scotland. Apart from this, you know, my dear boy, literature is eternal. If people read literature, they will enrich their mind. They will heighten their mind to a higher level, and they won't be able to commit any sort of crime. Because you see that Macbeth was not at all a villain. But how Macbeth gradually turned into a villain hero, it was quite astonishing. It is human nature. you must study human nature. Without having any knowledge of human nature, you cannot walk in your path of life. Okay? However, this play was first acted on Globe Theatre, on the stage of Globe Theatre in 1606 probably. Okay? And now I am telling you the third witch addressed him as the King of Scotland. And Macbeth was quite aware of the fact that the old King Duncan had two sons, Malcolm and Donalbain. So, it was quite impossible on his part to become the King of Scotland. But within a brief time, a messenger came from Duncan and addressed the general Macbeth as the Thane of Cawdor. And this title has been conferred on him because he had won the battle by defeating the Norwegian rebels. Okay? So the prediction of the second witch came into reality, and what remains is the prediction or the prophecy of the third witch. But the witches were quite indifferent to Banquo. But someone predicted that Banquo would not be king, but his successors are going to be the King of Scotland. So it was a seed of jealousy in the mind of Macbeth. In the mind of Macbeth, seed of jealousy was implanted in the mind of Macbeth. However, they returned home, and the tragic flaw in Macbeth's life was that he told everything about the prophecies or about the predictions of the witches. And he divulged everything to his wife. And it was the greatest tragic flaw in Macbeth's life. And it has been called that Lady Macbeth is the fourth witch. There were three witches, and Lady Macbeth was the fourth witch. And it was Lady Macbeth that instigated Macbeth to commit the heinous crime by inviting the old king to his beautiful castle and to kill the old hapless king when he will sleep. Okay? But first, Lady Macbeth entered, that is the fourth witch, entered the old king's room to kill him. But she saw with utter astonishment that the old king's face resembled her father's face. So she could not kill, and the fourth witch failed to kill the old king. Now, he entrusted, she entrusted her husband Macbeth with this task of killing the old king. When the crime was done, although there was a great struggle in the mind of Macbeth, because Duncan was his close relative, and at the same time, Duncan was the old king who gave him food, the titles, the Thane of Glamis, Corder, etc. However, it was done with the dagger, and Macbeth became the King of Scotland. Okay? Now let us come to the point that Shakespeare, when Shakespeare was writing his tragedies and comedies at the same time, he was quite aware of the psychology of the audience, because most of the audience believed in witchcraft, ghostly apparition, and many other weird facts of life. And all these horrid pictures of the witches attracted the audience, because at that time the tattlers, the peddlers, the vendors, the queen herself, and many bureaucrats came to enjoy theatre. Okay? So it served three purposes. One is corporal, the other is supernatural, and the third one is the personified temptation of Macbeth himself. Because Macbeth had the desire to become the King of Scotland. Okay? Because the predictions of the witches but where shall I waste my energy, my dear friend? Okay. Shakespeare was quite aware of the fact, and that is why he went to the witches for the second time, and there he called the witches again, and the witches also called another supernatural power, and he found them, Macbeth found them in a cave near the heath, where they were engaged in preparing their charms, in which they conjured up infernal spirits to reveal them futurity. Their horrid ingredients were toads, bats, and serpents, the eye of a newt, the tongue of a dog. All these horrid ingredients were too much liked by the then audience. Okay? The leg of lizard, the wing of a night owl, the scale of a dragon, the tooth of a wolf, the mummy of a witch, the root of hemlock, the gall of a goat, the liver of a Jew, and the finger of a dead child. All these were set on to boil in huge cauldron, okay, which was cooled with baboon's blood. To this, they poured in the blood of a sow, okay, that had eaten her young, and they threw into the flame the grease that had sweetened from a murderer's goblet. By these charms, they bound the infernal spirits to answer their questions. So, they are supernatural powers. They have utilized the horrid ingredients to arouse the infernal spirit. Okay. However, when the infernal spirit came, there were three of them. There were three of them. The first one looked like an armed head with an arm. All these are horrible sins, horrible sights. Okay? Called Macbeth by name and told him, beware of the Thane of Five. Thane of Five, that is Macbeth. And we know what is going to happen in future. Okay? Macbeth thanked them for the caution. He was envious of Macbeth, the Thane of Five. Okay? The second spirit arose in the likeness of a bloody child. Why bloody child? Because Macbeth had already killed Banquo. So, his hand is stained with blood. Bloody child. He called Macbeth by name and told him to have no fear of death, but to laugh and scorn at the power of man born naturally of a woman's womb. So everybody is born of a woman's womb. Who is not born of a woman's womb? But Macbeth did not know that Macbeth was born prematurely and he was taken out of his mother's womb in a premature condition. Okay? He advised him to be bold, bloody, and resolute. Then live Macbeth, remarked the king. However, the third spirit arose in the form of a crowned child. Why is it a crowned child? Because Banquo's successors were going to be the kings of Scotland. 8 generations ruled the throne of Scotland. Okay? With a tree in his hand. And you know that Birnam Wood came to the Dunsinane Hill. That means the soldiers broke the branches of the trees and put them on their helmet. And when they were proceeding or approaching, it seemed that a forest was approaching towards the hill. Okay. He also called Macbeth by name and comforted him against conspiracies and told him that he would never be vanquished until the woods of Birnam to Dunsinane Hill would come against him. Thus, the witches were nothing but the physical appearance just to satisfy the common audience, because people believed in witchcraft. And you know, if you go through the history of literature, you will find that at that time, that is during the regime of James, King James, actually Shakespeare was writing at the time of Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. At that time, people believed in witchcraft, and many women were killed as witches at that time. Even at that time in England, that is in Scotland, many old women who were called witches were killed. Near about 4,000 women were killed at that time. I have gone through history of literature. So, first of all, the witches are corporal. They satisfied the common audience, and at the second time, they are supernatural, that is ghostly. They also satisfy the common people, including the king, the queen, the bureaucrats, etc. And the third one is that one of the witches is nothing but the personified temptation of Macbeth himself. Thus, the witches bring about the greatest tragedy to the brave general Macbeth. Thanking all of you. Good night. Stay safe, stay mellow. And if you like my lecture on the witches of Macbeth, on request I am discussing, please like my channel and Easy Step to English Grammar. Please comment, share and subscribe please.